Hey everyone, and welcome to the first video in our intermediate section of the Riftbound General Strategy Guide. In this video, I want to talk about a conceptual model here that you see on screen to evaluate a game state. Now, understanding like who's winning and who's losing in a game state, either one that you've played or one that you're watching at your locals or something like that, is super important for a couple of reasons. One, you need to be able to identify in a game that you play where you went from winning to losing. At what point in the game, especially if you have a good start, I hear a lot of the time, oh, I was winning, and then somehow I lost the game, but I don't know where. I don't know where the turning point was. If you have a model like this, and you can apply it to your game states, your actual games or your VOD reviews or whatever you're doing to improve and get better, you'll understand what's important, why it's important, and how you lost the game. The other reason why having a model like this is super useful is it helps in your decision making. In a minute, we'll talk about some of the metrics and things that we use to evaluate the game state, and knowing which ones are the most important and why, and how they feed into that evaluation will let you make better decisions when you play, essentially. When you've got a choice between like developing your board or drawing extra cards or scoring a point or not scoring a point, understanding how valuable each one of those things are in comparison to each other will let you make better decisions in the long term. All right, so what I want to do is explain this model. We've got here on the left-hand side a bunch of things in green. Now, what they are measurable, let's say, parameters or characteristics of a game state. Okay, we'll go through them one at a time and I'll explain what they mean. And they are kind of summarized a little bit. So the wording might not be super accurate, but you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about for each one. The first thing we look at is resources. Now, this can be the amount of runes that you have. The more resources, the better, obviously, because you can play more stuff. But it also is a bit of a catch-all for things like trash size if you're running a deck that plays something like Rasa, where trash size can be used to discount cards and things like that. Trash is also a resource. And so that falls under this same sort of banner. So just resources in general, mainly talking about runes here. The next thing is hand size. And obviously, the more cards you have in your hand, the more options you have, the more things you can do to interact and the more paths you can take to victory. So the more cards in hand, generally, the better. Then there is deck power level. What I mean by this is the deck that you're playing has kind of like an average power per card, let's say, an average power level per card. To give two ends of the spectrum, one of them is like an aggro deck where there's like high concentration of two drops and cheap interaction. The cost of playing the spells and units and stuff in that deck is quite low. They're not super huge impact, but they get value from being able to play them out fast and kind of overwhelm your opponents in the early turns and score points quickly, right? The other end of the spectrum is like more controlling deck where you have really high power bombs, things like a Cathian Rain or Singularity or Dead Bloom Predator or something like that, where it's like these massive units, one card, but the power level is like quite high on them, high amount of might or development behind each one of the cards that they play. So why this is important is, a lot of the games that you see will get into something like a no board state. Both players have like huge amounts of resources but no hand, and you're in top deck mode, right? And an aggro deck in top deck mode, drawing like a 2 might unit every turn, is going to quickly get outclassed by a control deck where the power levels are things like Watcher and Time Walk and singularity, and so on. So that's why this is super important. You can't visibly see what the power level of the deck is, but you know, if you're familiar with the meta and you understand what decks are out there, you can kind of infer the power level of each deck that's in the format at the moment. All right, the next one is current might or development. I just want to call this development, but a lot of the times we use like how much might on board is each player has as a proxy for that development, but it also includes things like you know, hidden cards and gear and like things like that, unlicensed armory that can print soldiers every turn. That's a form of development, even though it might not be just like actual units and might on board. But obviously, a player with, you know, a 3 might unit on one side of the board, and then the other player having like 4 or 5 might units or something like that, the first player is well behind in might development compared to the second one. The next thing is position of that development. So there's something to be said here. It's not as important as like the total amount of development, but there's something to be said as like to units in base versus units on field. So units on field, on battlefields, are generally less valuable than units in base. Sure, there's potential to hold, and you know, you have to put them on battlefield to score and so on. But what we're trying to get at here is that units in base are a little bit better protected from you on your opponent's turn than the ones on field, because the ones on field they can walk into with their units. A lot of the removal can target on field, where only a subset of those can target in base as well. So there's a level of protection that the base offers as a location for your development. That's why things like you know, units that can sit in the back and still generate value are really, really good. The last thing is your current points. More specifically, it's like how many turns it's going to take you before you win. But current points is a close proxy to that. Obviously, there's some variance here in terms of battlefields, like if you're playing Aspirant's Climb or something like that, where it's to 9 instead of 8. You know, that it's going to change things slightly, but concepts around like point parity and that come into play here. So these are the things that you can look at. You look at the player's hand size, amount of resources, infer their deck power level, look at their current development and where that development is, and their current points. And from these things, you should be able to come up with a pretty good evaluation as to who's winning. Now, how you do that is in these next layers, which we'll get into in a second. But the last thing I want to call out is that you don't just do this for one player. Obviously, this is you're doing it for yourself and your opponent, and then there's some trade-offs here. And you've got to evaluate both sides of the game state. Okay. Next, how do these link together? Conceptually, it's pretty straightforward. The amount of resources that you have combined with what you can play out of your hand versus combined with like what you can draw out of your deck and so on, combine into your ability to develop your board, essentially. Right? So we call it ability for development interaction. It's not so much just your board. Like we also count things like removal spells or combat tricks and stuff in here. It's like your ability to develop your board and interact with your opponent. Okay, that affects both your board state, and if you've got some interaction like removal or something, you can also interact directly with your opponent's board state and remove their units. But essentially, these three things combine to inform how much stuff you can spew out onto the board in a turn. Okay, hope that makes sense. Then that leads us to what is your actual current board state, made up of what you have and where it is. Okay, your board state and your opponent's board state both influence how easy it is for you to score more points. All right, so if you're way ahead on board state, it's typically easier for you to score new points, because you can conk, you can hold, and even through some trades and stuff of your opponent, if you've still got might and development left, you can continue to score points. Okay. So there's a offensive and defensive aspect to these, like how easy it is for you to hold versus conquer and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, it's just how easy is it for you to, or for that player to rack up more points. The last thing here is what points are you on, combined with how easy it is for you to rack up more points. Those are the two main influences to the evaluation, both on your side and your opponent's side. What this means is it doesn't matter if you're on like 7 points. If you have no potential to score new points, these two scores are like multiplicative, right? So 0 times 7 is still 0. You're not going to be able to close out the game, even if you're at 7, if you have 0 ability to score new points because you're way behind in development and you don't have any hand or resources and so on. Okay, that's the concept that control decks kind of aim for, is like your opponent can typically go up on points, but eventually they will have a much better board state than you, and even a board state with a low scoring point potential. Let's say they're at 2 points and they've got a couple of units on board versus none. This one will win out because they're multiplicative. Okay, so the control deck will win in this scenario a lot of the time. The reason why things like Vi Ride the Wind as a combo from set 1 are really strong is because it shortens the distance between playing a unit from hand to moving it to a battlefield to scoring a point and then influencing your evaluation. 2-card combo from hand, Vi Ride the Wind has the potential to score 2 points really quickly. And so anything that you can do to kind of bridge this gap is really, really strong. That's why things like Time Walk are really, really strong, because you can walk onto battlefields, Time Walk from hand, and generate 4 points really, really fast. So, outside of those kind of niche combo sort of pieces, though, the relative importance of these factors goes in this direction. So the most important factor is your score, like your score line, current points, or how many turns it takes you to win. Then next is your development and where it is, and then lastly, your deck power level and hand and resources and so on. And this is something that you can kind of see through a lot of practice. It's a very tempo-based game where it's points and development are the most important factors, and that's why things like hand size and stuff are kind of a little bit less important in this game than in other games. I come from a Magic background, and in Magic, there's the ability to go straight from hand to points. So you can lightning bolt your opponent, and a card from hand then directly minuses like their life total or their points equivalent in that game. In Riftbound, a lot of the cards, at least in the current sets, can't do that. And so you have to go from hand to board to battlefield to score and then to points. And these layers of additional steps that you need to do for each of those kind of moves and combats and so on devalue these 3 elements in the evaluation. Now, they are important. It's just that they're lower than these next two, and also lower than this one because there's less steps to get there. So I hope that makes sense. When you're evaluating a game state, it's usually about points and then development, and lastly, the runes, resources, and deck power level. So start thinking about these things when you're looking at your mates' games and seeing who's winning, and think about it in terms of these 6 things on the side. Hope it helps. Cheers.